Hey everybody, welcome back to class. This is your crazy professor, Frank Markow here. Now you might be saying, why did he start off this week's lesson playing a Beethoven song on the harmonica? That was just weird at so many levels. Well, here's why. Because we all know Ludwig von Beethoven was the composer who changed the world of music. And when you think about classical music, chances are you're thinking about Beethoven, right? Now, you're probably not thinking about Beethoven on a harmonica. Let's face it, that would be silliness. But he's made an impact on the world of music. And that's what leaders do, is they make impact on the rest of the world. And so that's my cheesy segue to you all to talk about leadership. This week, we're going to talk all about leadership. This is my favorite topic. Why is that? Not because I get to play my harmonica, but because that's my PhD, is in organizational leadership. And so this is the one topic I probably know the most about in all of organizational behavior. I could do a whole class on leadership. In fact, I teach whole classes on organizational leadership. It's what I do. And so this week I'm just going to share just a little fraction of ideas and go over some of the big picture here to help you understand the field and why leadership is important to organizations. Now, you probably already know this, right? Well, leadership is important. Well, duh, I already knew that one, Dr. Markow. Yeah, but I want to help you know a little bit more. Okay, so buckle in here because we're going to take a whirlwind tour through the world of leadership. We're going to look at what are called the traditional approaches and the contemporary approaches, and then we're going to look at the sad but true reality of power and politics and what leaders have to do with all those things. So hang on, here we go. Now, when they first began to study about leadership, there was this idea called the great man theories, right? No, sorry, ladies, this was before women were all that engaged in leadership, at least on a formal organizational level. But the great man theories thought that leaders were born with certain traits or qualities that set them apart from non-leaders. And so they looked at leaders, great history, leaders from history, of course, as biblical people, David and Jesus and Moses. They looked at great people in over time, like Napoleon and all these, Charlemagne and Augustine and all these leaders from the centuries and presidents, Lincoln and everybody. And they tried to distinguish leaders from non-leaders. And they would look at things like how high they were, how their body size, the shape of their head, phrenology, and all these weird things, a birth order, were they born first or last, middle children, age, all those sort of things. And at the end of the day, what they discovered was, ta-da, there was no trait, there was no quality that separated leaders from non-leaders. Oh, what a disaster. So this whole idea of the great man theory, or also which evolved into what's called the trait theory, which is studying personal characteristics, kind of hit a dead end. And so this was kind of in the late 40s, the whole trait movement came to an end. However, there's still, lots of remnants, and there's actually been considered a resurgence of trait theory in the organizational leadership literature, because there are still a lot of traits that are important. Now, it doesn't have to do with the size of your head or your birth order, those sorts of things, but things like personality are still important in leadership. And there are certain qualities that have consistently been found to be present in effective leaders. So things such as integrity, right? Things such as humility, things such as confidence, such as self-determination. These are important traits that leaders have that set them apart. At least effective leaders have those kinds of traits. So, and we also know the personality, different type of personality traits impact one's leadership effectiveness. So the trait school is not dead. It kind of took a right turn, but it's still with us. And so your personality, who you are, the things that you bring to the table, your characteristics are all important aspects of leadership, right? Okay, but that's just the beginning point, right? Because one of the things we know about leadership is that it's a process and it's an interaction between the leader, the follower, and the environment, right? So just looking at the traits, just looking at who you are is only one part of the formula. And I think this is kind of the short-sighted part of sort of the popular approach to leadership. It often just looks at you, your values, your attitude, your characteristic, even from a Christian perspective, your godliness, or your devotion, or those kinds of things. Now, those are all important, don't get me wrong, but it's only part of the picture. It's only part of the picture. Now, the next turn that was taken in leadership studies was what's called the behavioral approaches, right? It wasn't just about who leaders were, but it's about what leaders did. And it came down, they did a lot of study, and there's the Ohio State studies, and Ohio State and Michigan State studies, and they basically boiled it down to this idea that leaders did two things. They managed the tasks, and they manage relationships, right? So this idea of task and relationship became sort of the new paradigm by which to think about leadership. So it's not one or the other, right? It can't just be just about the task or just about the relationship, but it has to be both of these things. And some of the early schools, like Blake and Mouton, kind of came up with this hypothetical high leader. They were high on task and high on people. And that was what was called a team leader. And, that's important, right? I mean, you want to be high on task, right? In other words, getting your job done, accomplishing, and you want to be high on people, motivating people, understanding people, working with people, inspiring people, all those sorts of things. Those are important as well. And so doing both of those things important both of those things well is important. However, later on, this whole behavioral approach took a right turn and it moved into what's called situational leadership. Situational leadership said, well, sometimes you want to be high on task and sometimes you want to be high on people. You don't necessarily always want to be high. That's not always optimal. And in a nutshell, the idea behind situational leadership says that if somebody is lacking job maturity, and by maturity we mean the skills that they need to do the job and the confidence that they need to do the job. If they're low on those things, you want to be high on task, right? You don't want to be high on people at that point. They don't need a cheerleader or a therapist. They need somebody to show them how to get the job done. And on the other end of the spectrum, if somebody is highly mature, if they have good experience and their confidence, you don't need to be high either. You almost need to be hands off. At that point, you can delegate and let that person run with the job. Now, there's a whole spectrum in between here, and your textbook will have that model. But basically, that's the thrust of situational leadership, is adjusting whether you're high on people, high on task, depending upon where the maturity level of your follower is. So somewhere in the middle there is high on people and low on task. Let's just say you have somebody who's got a lot of experience, right? But now they're demotivated. Okay, so the experience is high, confidence is low, motivation is low. So now you want to be more of a cheerleader, right? You want to be more on the people side and encourage them to get the job done. They don't need to be shown what to do. They know what to do, right? Obviously, they've lost the motivation. So you want to focus on the people side of what's going on. And the problem that some managers have is that they have the same approach with everybody no matter where they're at, and they don't adjust. So they're always high on people, or they're always high on tasks, and they don't realize that people come in with these different maturity levels that they need to adjust their approach to. So for example, let's just say you have a newbie who comes in, low maturity, low confidence, right? Does not know his job that well, and doesn't have the confidence to do it. And you'll come in like you're the cheerleader. Hey, I love you, brother. You're going to do a great job here. Oh, man, just you go for it. And you let me know if you need any help. And they're sitting there going, oh, my gosh, I don't know what to do. So they're going to flounder, right? That's a mismatch. Now, the opposite is true, too. Let's just say you have somebody who comes in with a lot of maturity, a lot of skills and background, and you treat them like it's their first day on the job and say, okay, here's what you need to do. Now, here's the 5 tasks I need done. Here's how I need them done, and I need them done by this date. And they're thinking, well, why is this guy telling me all this stuff, right? That's what we call micromanaging, right? So you don't want to micromanage somebody with a lot of skill. At that point, you need to back out, maybe a little high on the relational, right? Help them set goals, perhaps. But you don't need to micromanage them because they have the maturity. So that's another mismatch in your leadership style, right? So that's what the situational leadership kind of told us in the whole thing. Now, the next idea that came along, pretty much, well, there's a few other ones. There's leadership member exchange. That's an important one too, LMX. This has to do with in-groups and out-groups, right? And so the idea of LMX says that leaders form groups, and people that are on the in-group get more confidence, trust, input, rewards, face time with the leader than those who are on the out group. And so this kind of makes sense, right? I mean, even Jesus had an in-group and an out-group, right? He had the 3 and he had the 12. But there's benefits that accrue to those on the in-group that don't accrue to those on the out-group. And so that led to this idea of leader making, which said, let's be intentional about this. Let's bring people into the in-group, right? Because if those people perform better, if they're more committed to the organization, they set higher goals, they're more, motivated, all those sorts of things, then we got to do all we can to help people be on the in-group. So leaders, open up your group somewhat, right? So if it's just you and 2 other people that you confide in, groom people. And again, this is a process. The LMX talks about this process of from being an acquaintance to, a stranger to acquaintance to a friend, right? So we kind of bring people through this process. And I understand, we all understand, you have to trust some people, right? And they have to have a track record with you. You're not just going to become best friends with somebody that just started working for you, but you have to give people the opportunity, right, to enter in time. Then all of a sudden you give them that trust and that confidence, and they will perform better. They'll be more motivated, they'll be more engaged, they will do better for you, right? So some leaders kind of have this erroneous view that I have to kind of lock myself into a corner and I can only let myself, be known to a couple people. Perhaps they've been hurt in the past. Perhaps you've been hurt in the past or burned or whatever, and you're like, I'm not doing that one again. Well, what you're doing is you're excluding a lot of high potential people from coming into your inner circle, and you're not developing the degree to which they could be developed. So figure out what your hangups are and why you're putting people out. Let them in, let them get to know you, let them move from an acquaintance, from a stranger to acquaintance to a friend. And guess what? You're going to transform that relationship, and you're going to have some pretty high-performing people working for you. All right, so after LMX, you had some other ideas. Probably the biggest one that took over in the 80s and the 90s was transformational leadership. And I believe the book would categorize transformational leadership as more of a modern approach, okay? So traits, behaviors, situation, LMX, I think would be considered traditional. And then you move into some of the new approaches, modern approaches, starting with transformation. So you have transformational, you have authentic, you have charismatic, and then of course you've got servant and a few other ones, right? So whole other new ones. So transformational, though, really kind of changed the paradigm in leadership studies, because what that said was, it wasn't just about people, tasks, people, relationships, those sorts of things, but now the leader's job is to provide inspirational motivation and information and inspiration and all those sorts of things, right? So the leader now was more of an architect, was more of a spokesperson, a statesman, if you will, for the values of the organization. So if you think a lot of great leaders, they're inspirational and they're visionary, and we look up to leaders like that. So we look up to, guys like Steve Jobs and other people who are larger than life, Richard Branson, and some people would say that these people were actually charismatic leaders, but they had this ability to transform their organizations and even culture because they had these visions and larger than life. So let's talk about charisma for a second, okay? Because charisma and charismatic leadership is another approach, one of these modern approaches to looking at leadership. And charisma basically says that there is a special non-quantifiable something that some leaders have that's able to inspire people, to motivate them, et cetera, et cetera. So transformational leadership said that you have to have some charisma, but that wasn't sufficient to be transformational. Charismatic leadership says, it's about that charisma. So they're related, but they're a little bit separate. And a lot of people argue that transformational leadership is actually more effective and important, because the transformational leader, their goal is to build up the people, is where the charismatic leader, the goal is for the people to build up the leader, right? So you think a lot of famous, charismatic leaders who have come and gone over the centuries, and that's typically what happens. So Max Weber said this about charismatic leadership: it's the most, it's the most unstable form of legitimate authority, right? It can be legitimate, but it's unstable because the people raise this guy up, and the people can let that person down too. Transformational leadership is more about building the people up. And it's about transforming their thinking, and it's about giving people information and inspiration and individual consideration, right? So if you look at Bass and Burns' model, they have these 4 I's. So individual consideration, inspiration, and a couple other I's. So the idea, though, is that the leader invests into the people. So it's not just about the person, than just a leader. It's not just about my ability to inspire and motivate you, but it's also about my ability to inform you, right? To give you the information you need to do your job, to consider you as an individual. Okay, so these are important differences between transformational and charismatic. Charismatics don't do that, because charismatics, deep in their hearts, are a bit narcissistic, and they cannot give up anything. If they give something up, it takes away from them. And so they're always hold on to that. They're not very quick to praise and those sorts of things, okay? So I'm not discounting charismatic leaders. They've done a lot of good things for the world. They've also done a lot of bad things for the world. So I don't want to spend too much time on this whole, transformational charismatic thing, but that's it in a nutshell, and you can read more about it in your textbook as well. Then, of course, some of the other ideas about leadership that have gained currency are things like servant leadership. Now, again, as Christians, we think like, well, duh, that's been around for a long time, right? Jesus was a servant leader, right? Matthew 25, and, washing the disciples' feet, and he said, if you want to be great in the kingdom, you have to be a servant to all. Well, there was a guy named Greenleaf who came along and articulated that idea as well. And he based his ideas on a book called Journey to the East, which was influential in his thinking. And then a guy named Larry Spears came along and articulated these 10 ideas of a servant leader. Leaders were listening, they were empathetic, they built community, right? They put others' needs ahead of themselves. And so one of the challenges or one of the critiques is, well, can you be a business leader and be a servant leader? It sounds great. Maybe it works for some pastors. Does it really work? Well, they've actually done some research on this, and servant leaders actually can develop high-performing organizations. So being a servant doesn't mean being a doormat. It doesn't mean, not being strong in your own vision, but it's just a different approach in dealing with people. And again, as a leader, if our goal is to build people up, then serving them and understanding their needs and building community, well, what a wonderful way to do that. Authentic leadership is another idea that's kind of gotten a lot of currency in the literature. This idea that I'm true to myself. I articulate what's important to me, my values. My leadership comes from something that is personally and passionately important to me. One of the classic examples is the founder of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? She founded this organization not because, she was picking a career and decided to be an activist, but her son was killed by a drunk driver. And she said, never again should this happen to another mother. And so she began to organize and form this organization. And, only the Lord knows how many deaths have been prevented by the organization. But we know incidents of drunk driving has gone down tremendously. And so, this was something born out of her passion, her own experience. And so authentic leaders are people that let their passion and experience drive them to do what it is that they do. So what they do is an authentic expression of who they are, all right? Now, there's been some critiques and kickbacks on this one as well. It's kind of interesting, we're here in 2019 now, and all of a sudden I'm hearing all these negative things about authentic leadership, and you kind of wonder if it's because of Donald Trump, right? Because he's very authentic. People know exactly what he stands for. He's very clear. He's very, he makes his way known. And if you don't like it, then that's, you vote Democrat. So now all of a sudden it's like, well, we're not sure if being authentic is really all that good of an idea. So anyhow, I don't want to get too political here, but I'm starting to hear some pushback on this whole idea of authenticity. And maybe it's better to be a little more guarded and don't always let yourself be true. And then there's this other idea that sometimes you got to fake it till you make it, right? I'm not the real deal, but I aspire to. I want to be the leader of this organization. And so I have to sort of pretend, to be the person that I want to become, right? So I'm kind of growing into this stature that I aspire to be. Well, that's not really being authentic either, is it? If I was authentic, I'd say, you know what? I don't know anything about this organization. I raised up some capital money, from some investors, and here we go, right? That would be authentic. But nobody ever does that, right? People don't act like that. They don't think like that. So anyhow, there's some other ideas out there, but I could probably go on and on. But I'm just going to stop right about there. You can read plenty on leadership, look up some of my other videos, and you'll learn a lot. Then the last thing I'm going to talk about this week in relation to leadership is power and politics. Now, power tends to be a dirty word in organizations, right? We don't like to think of people as having power, wielding power, especially if you're a Christian, right? This isn't something that we aspire to. Again, we want to be servant leaders, right? We don't want to wield it over people, right? So power tends to have a negative connotation. But the reality is that there's always going to be power in an organization. Some people are going to have it, and some people aren't. Now again, as Christian leaders, it shouldn't be our aspirations to have power and to wield it over people, but we do need to understand how it's obtained and what are different types of powers. So, not power, it's a different type of power. So, French and Raven came up with a great model. There's 5 points of power in their model. I think it's very helpful. They talk about legitimate power, and this is the power that you get because of the office that you occupy. You know, a CEO has power just because that's the role he or she is in. But then there's reward power. I have power because I can give you something, right? So maybe the financial person, or maybe I can give you something you need other than financial. There's expert power. This is the power that comes when you know more about a topic than anybody else knows, right? Or at least you have the expertise in a certain area, and all of a sudden you become powerful. You know, so let me give you an example of this one here. You know, let's just say everything's working fine, and in your office, and one day all the computers go down, the network goes down, the internet goes down. Oh my gosh, where's Joe, the internet guy? Where's Joe? We got to get him on the line. We need to fix this. And all of a sudden everything stops until we get Joe in the office and he can fix the internet. Who became the most powerful person in that moment? It was Joe, right? Because he's an expert in the internet, right? And so nobody cares about Joe every other day, but all of a sudden it's like, oh, come on in, brother. Hey, can we get you some coffee? Oh, come on, y'all, we're so glad to see you. We just love you, man. Can you get our internet going? All of a sudden he became, like, you know, extremely important and powerful that day. And if he needed $1,000, go buy a new router or whatever he needed to buy, you'd cut a check just like that, right? All right, so that's based on his expertise. Another one, too, is what's called coercion power. Now, this is the bad kind. This is where, you know, you have power because you can force your will over people. And this is when I think about, like, law enforcement, right? Anybody carrying a gun, anybody carrying a big stick, anybody who can throw you in jail, that's coercion power. But it's also used in more subtle ways in organizations, right? Intimidations, threats, bullying, right? These are all forms of coercion. I'm getting you to do something because you are afraid of me. I intimidate you, right? This isn't usually a good approach. And then the last one is referent power. It's almost the opposite of coercion. And referent power says, I have power over you because you like me, right? I can get you to do things because we have a good relationship. You like my personality, you like who I am, you like our relationship from the past, right? So it's called referent power. So it has nothing to do with your legitimate position or, you know, what you know or anything. It's simply because, you know, you like me as a person. All right, so that's French and Raven on power. You know, politics is kind of a never-ending cycle in organizations. Some people have a lot of power just because of their boundary spanning role. So for example, the boss's secretary, you know, he or she can have a lot of power because they are the gatekeeper, right? So certain people are gatekeepers. There's some people that get power in the organization that have no official position, right? Now, board of directors, well, I guess that's an official position, but sometimes board members can yield power just because of their board status. So they're not even a manager or anything like that. And I guess it's legitimate for them to have that position, or that power. But you understand what I mean. Sometimes people get power in organizations based on things that have nothing to do with their formal position in the organization. All right, so that's about all I'm going to say about that. Well, I covered a lot of ground today. And again, like I said, leadership's my thing. I love talking about it. I could probably talk for some more. And again, maybe you could take a class, a leadership class, you know, for me in the future or from somebody else. And again, at Life Pacific University, we believe in biblical leadership, and I believe you're going to take a class in biblical leadership, and that's important as well, right? We need to understand about the character and the heart of a leader and all those sorts of things as well. So hopefully this added a little bit from the organizational leadership literature that was helpful for you. Lots of good books out there. I recommend Peter Northhouse's book, Leadership Theory and Practice. Coos and Posner's Leadership Challenge is another kind of classic out there I recommend. A lot of good information out there on leadership. Be careful though, be a discriminating consumer of information about leadership. There's so much out there. You know, every coach, every politician now has a book on leadership. You know, and some are more important than others. Just make a distinction between what I call pop press, you know, leadership books, you know, written by somebody who's had some success as a leader, and some of these other ideas that are a little more grounded in the social science research. Might be a little more academic and dry, but they're going to have more currency because this guy is going to have some great stories, and his approach worked for him, but it hasn't been turned into a theory that's been field tested in other contexts, right? So a good theory has to be able to work in a variety of contexts. So just because it worked for this pastor or for this this business leader doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work for you. So again, they're interesting and we love to read them. You know, we go to the airport and we buy the latest, business leadership book. But take those with a grain of salt. Those approaches may not necessarily work for you. Some of these other ideas that I've been talking about for example, situational leadership, transformational, right, authentic. These have a lot more research behind them, and they've been proven to work in different contexts. We can actually prove that these approaches work to leadership as opposed they work to improve organizational performance, as opposed to some of these other ones, which are interesting, but there's no proven track record other than that person, right? So that's important. So if that's good enough for you, then hey, stock up on those popular press books. But as for me as a leadership researcher and scholar, I tend to lean this way. I like these books, but these are the ones I teach over here because I believe they have more currency in the long run to impact organizational performance. Anyhow, that's it for now. Blessings to you guys. We've only got one more week left, so hang in there. It's going to be a good one, and I will see you all online.